The world fell in love with a 16-year-old girl who sang about rainbows, never knowing she had already been performing for someone else's dreams for 14 years. Frances Ethel Gum was 2 years old when she first walked onto a stage in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Most children that age are learning to speak in full sentences. Frances was learning that her value came from making strangers happy, and that her own happiness was never part of the equation. Her mother, Ethel, had dreams that were bigger than their small town could contain. When she looked at Frances, she didn't see a toddler who needed protection and guidance. She saw possibility, profit, and a path to the spotlight that had always eluded her. Frank, her father, was gentler but powerless to resist the momentum that Ethel created around their youngest daughter. The Gum sisters were born out of Ethel's ambition. Frances and her older sisters, Mary Jane and Dorothy Virginia, became a traveling act when Frances was barely old enough to remember choosing anything else. They performed at movie theaters during intermissions, their small voices filling spaces meant for much older entertainers. Frances learned early that applause meant approval, and approval meant survival in their family. But what nobody in those audiences could see was how exhaustion had already begun to live in Frances's eyes. The family moved to California when Frances was 4, chasing the promise of Hollywood like thousands of other families with talented children. But unlike most of those families, they actually found what they were looking for. By the time Frances was 10, talent scouts were noticing the unusual quality of her voice: mature, emotional, capable of conveying feelings that most children her age hadn't even experienced yet. This is where the real story begins, though it would take decades for anyone to understand what was actually happening. In 1934, when Frances was 12, she was signed to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood. To most people, this looked like a dream come true. A small-town girl with an extraordinary voice was getting her chance at stardom. The newspapers wrote about her as if she were the luckiest child in America. They changed her name to Judy Garland because Frances Gum didn't sound like a star. She accepted this without question, just as she accepted everything else that was decided for her. At 12, she had already learned that her preferences were less important than other people's plans. But the studio system of the 1930s and 1940s was not designed to protect children, even the ones who were making the millions of dollars. MGM didn't just control Judy's career. They controlled her body, her schedule, her education, and eventually her chemistry. Studio executives decided when she would eat, how much she would weigh, when she would sleep, and how she would feel. They gave her pills to stay awake for 18-hour shooting days, then pills to fall asleep when the work was finally done. She was 13 when this routine became normal for her, though it would never be called normal by anyone who understood child development. The studio system had a term for what they did to young performers. They seasoned them, like meat being prepared for consumption. Child stars were processed through a system that prioritized their commercial value over their humanity. Judy was seasoned with incredible efficiency. Her education happened between takes, when it happened at all. Her social development occurred under studio lights, surrounded by adults whose primary concern was her productivity. Her emotional needs were considered only when they interfered with filming schedules. When she was 15, she recorded Over the Rainbow for a movie that would make her famous around the world. The song was almost cut from the final version of The Wizard of Oz because studio executives thought it was too slow, too emotional, too much like something a real person might sing instead of a cartoon character. But Judy's performance of that song contained something that couldn't be manufactured or directed: genuine longing. When she sang about birds flying over the rainbow and wondered why she couldn't, she wasn't just playing Dorothy. She was expressing her own desire for a life where someone else wasn't always making the decisions. The audience heard hope in her voice, but what they were actually hearing was grief for a childhood that had ended before it began. The Wizard of Oz made Judy Garland a household name overnight, but it also trapped her in an image that she would never be allowed to outgrow. America fell in love with Dorothy. Innocent, optimistic, trusting. Studio executives made sure that Judy's public persona never strayed too far from that character, even as she grew older, and her real experiences grew darker. When reporters interviewed her, studio representatives were always present to guide the conversation away from anything that might disturb the illusion. Behind the scenes, The pills were becoming a bigger part of her daily routine. Amphetamines to wake up, barbiturates to sleep, appetite suppressants to maintain the weight that cameras demanded. By the time she was 17, Judy's natural sleep cycle had been completely disrupted by chemicals. Her natural hunger cues had been overridden by medication. Her natural energy patterns had been replaced by artificial highs and crashes. The studio doctors who prescribed these medications called them vitamins and supplements. They told Judy she needed them to stay healthy under the pressure of her demanding schedule. They never told her she was developing dependencies that would follow her for the rest of her life. When she tried to resist the regimen, when she asked for breaks, or expressed concerns about how the pills were making her feel, she was reminded of how many people depended on her success. The studio employed hundreds of people who worked on her films. The theaters that showed her movies employed thousands more. The fans who bought tickets were counting on her to entertain them. Her family's financial security depended on her continued cooperation with whatever the studio required. At 18, she was told she was too old to be America's sweetheart, but too young to be a serious actress. This left her in a strange limbo where she was expected to maintain the enthusiasm of a child while handling the responsibilities of an adult. But what happened next would prove that she had never really been either. In 1941, when Judy was 19, she experienced what the studio called a nervous breakdown. She was hospitalized for exhaustion, though the official story was that she had the flu. During her time away from filming, she tried to stop taking the pills that had regulated her life for 6 years. The withdrawal was devastating. Her body didn't remember how to function without chemical assistance. Sleep became impossible, then inevitable at random times. Her appetite disappeared completely, then returned with frightening intensity. Her emotions, which had been numbed and managed by medication, came flooding back without any natural coping mechanisms to contain them. The studio doctors convinced her that she needed to resume the medication routine for her own health and safety. This was the moment when Judy began to understand that she wasn't just contracted to MGM. She was owned by them, in a way that made escape feel impossible. The pills weren't just managing her energy and weight anymore. They were managing her ability to imagine any other kind of life. When she returned to work, something fundamental had changed in her relationship with performing. The joy that had once been natural, even in difficult circumstances, now required more effort to access and maintain. The spontaneity that had made her early performances so compelling was replaced by a more deliberate, controlled approach. She was still extraordinarily talented, but the source of that talent had been altered by circumstances that were entirely beyond her control. Her personal relationships suffered as the line between her public and private selves became increasingly blurred. She married David Rose in 1941 when she was 19. The marriage lasted 2 years, ending in divorce when the pressures of her career made normal domestic life impossible. Her schedule was set by studio executives who didn't consider her husband's needs or her own desires for a stable home life. During this period, she began to understand that fame hadn't given her more choices. It had eliminated most of them. The demands of maintaining her public image meant that she couldn't express frustration, exhaustion, or unhappiness without risking her career. The studio's investment in her success meant that her personal struggles were always secondary to their business concerns. The public's attachment to her wholesome image meant that any signs of real human complexity were carefully hidden from view. By her mid-20s, Judy had been performing professionally for over 20 years. She had never held a regular job, never lived independently, never made a major life decision without considering how it would affect her career first. But this is where the story takes a turn that nobody could have predicted. Instead of becoming bitter or withdrawn, Judy began to use her pain as a source of artistic power. Her performances in the late 1940s and early 1950s contained an emotional depth that couldn't be taught or manufactured. She had learned to transform suffering into something that could touch other people's hearts. A Star is Born, in 1954, showcased this transformed artistry in a way that shocked audiences who had only known her as Dorothy. Her performance as Vicki Lester was raw, honest, and heartbreaking in ways that her earlier work had never been. She was finally playing a character whose struggles resembled her own. The film was a critical success, but it also revealed how much the years of controlled living had cost her. Her marriage to Vincente Minnelli had ended in divorce, despite producing a daughter, Liza, who would inherit both her mother's talent and some of her struggles. Her relationship with the studio system had become increasingly adversarial as she fought for more control over her projects and her life. The pills that had once helped her meet impossible demands were now making those demands even more difficult to handle. Her weight fluctuated dramatically as her metabolism tried to adjust to years of chemical manipulation. Her sleep patterns remained erratic, making it difficult to maintain the consistency that film production required. Her emotional state became less predictable as the medications that had once managed her feelings lost their effectiveness. Studio executives began to view her as a liability rather than an asset, though they were careful not to say this publicly. The woman who had once been their most reliable and profitable performer was now requiring special accommodations, extended shooting schedules, and delicate handling that didn't align with the efficiency-focused studio system. In 1950, MGM released her from her contract after 18 years of service. The official statement said it was a mutual decision that would allow her to pursue more diverse projects. The reality was that she had become too complicated for a system that valued simplicity and control above all else. For the first time since she was 12 years old, Judy was unemployed and uncertain about her future. This period of professional rejection coincided with a personal crisis that would define the rest of her life. Without the structure that the studio system had provided, she struggled to create routines and boundaries for herself, the skills that most adults develop gradually during their 20s and 30s. Financial management, relationship building, self-care had never been part of her education. She began performing in nightclubs and concert halls, rediscovering the intimate connection with audiences that had been lost during her movie career. These live performances revealed something that the controlled environment of film sets had hidden. Judy had become an artist capable of channeling universal human experiences through her voice and presence. Audiences didn't just admire her talent anymore, they felt understood by it. But the freedom to express herself artistically came with challenges that she wasn't equipped to handle alone. Without studio doctors managing her medication, she began to self-medicate in ways that were even more dangerous than the controlled regimen she had lived with for so many years. Without studio schedules structuring her days, she struggled with the basic rhythms of eating, sleeping, and working that most people establish naturally during childhood and adolescence. Her relationships became increasingly complicated as she tried to find people who could understand the unique circumstances of her life. She married Sidney Luft in 1952, and their relationship was passionate but turbulent. He understood the entertainment business, but couldn't protect her from the internal struggles that years of controlled living had created. They had 2 children together, Lorna and Joey, but Judy's unpredictable schedule and ongoing health issues made consistent parenting difficult. The woman who had spent her entire life taking care of other people's needs, audiences, studio executives, family members, had never learned how to take care of herself. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Judy's live performances became legendary for their emotional intensity and unpredictability. Some nights, she delivered concerts that audiences would remember for the rest of their lives. Other nights, she struggled to complete her set, overwhelmed by exhaustion or medication effects that she couldn't control. But even on her most difficult nights, something extraordinary happened between Judy and her audience. People who attended her concerts during this period often described feeling like they were witnessing something sacred, not just entertainment, but a form of communion between an artist and the people who needed what she was offering. Her vulnerability on stage created space for other people to acknowledge their own struggles and pain. This connection with audiences became both her greatest strength and her deepest burden. She knew that people came to her concerts carrying their own heartaches, looking for someone who could understand what it felt like to hurt in ways that couldn't be easily explained or fixed. She felt a responsibility to honor that trust, even when doing so required her to access parts of herself that were already damaged by years of being accessed without adequate protection. Her 1961 concert at Carnegie Hall was recorded and became one of the greatest live albums in entertainment history. But the performance that night also demonstrated how much energy it took for her to give audiences what they needed from her. By the mid-1960s, the cost of this level of emotional availability was becoming unsustainable. Her health problems were mounting, as the long-term effects of prescription drug use compounded with the stress of financial difficulties and complicated personal relationships. Her marriage to Sidney Luft had ended in divorce, and subsequent relationships struggled under the weight of her fame and the expectations that came with it. She moved to London in the late 1960s, hoping that distance from Hollywood might give her space to rebuild her life on more manageable terms. But the patterns that had been established during her childhood proved difficult to change, even with geographical distance and professional independence. The habit of prioritizing other people's needs over her own, the tendency to use work as a way of avoiding personal problems, the reliance on chemical solutions for emotional and physical challenges, these had become so fundamental to her identity that changing them felt like losing herself entirely. Her final performances in London were attended by audiences who understood they might be witnessing the end of something irreplaceable. She died in 1969, at the age of 47, in her London apartment. The official cause of death was an accidental overdose of barbiturates, but the real cause was much more complicated than any medical examiner could document. Judy Garland died from a lifetime of being valued more for what she could give to other people than for who she was as a human being. The little girl who had learned at age 2 that her worth was determined by her ability to make strangers happy had grown into a woman who couldn't imagine existing without that validation, even when the cost of earning it had become more than she could bear. But what makes her story more than just a cautionary tale about child stardom is the extraordinary artistry that emerged from her struggles. Her best performances contained a quality that can't be replicated or taught: absolute honesty about the complexity of human experience. She sang about hope and heartbreak with equal conviction because she had lived both completely. Her audiences trusted her because she never pretended that life was simpler than it actually was. The child who never got to be a child became an adult who could speak to the parts of other people that had also been denied protection and nurturing. When she sang "Over the Rainbow" in her later concerts, the song carried different meanings than it had when she was 16. The longing in her voice was no longer hypothetical or theatrical. It was real, earned, and impossible to ignore. The world that had fallen in love with Dorothy's innocence discovered that Judy's experience was actually more valuable than any character she could play. Her legacy isn't just the movies and recordings she left behind, but the permission she gave other people to be complicated, wounded, and still worthy of love and admiration. She proved that perfection isn't necessary for greatness, and that sometimes the most beautiful art comes from the places that hurt the most. The rainbow she sang about was never meant to be a destination she could reach, but a symbol of the distance between what we dream of and what we're given. Maybe the real tragedy isn't that Judy Garland died young, but that she lived so long without anyone asking what she needed to survive. The world applauded her strength, but no one thought to question why a child needed to be that strong in the first place.